last couple of years, naked bikes gained an enormous amount of popularity all around the world. Today we'll be looking into Yamaha's naked lineup consisting of the MT-07, MT-09, and the MT-10. We will contrast and compare each one of these motorcycles against each other and see which one fit you the best as a potential buyer or a potential subscriber of this YouTube channel. On the least powerful end of this motorcycle lineup, we have the Yamaha MT-07. When it comes to physical construction of this motorcycle, it is visible right away that corners were cut in order to save on cost. When it comes to simple necessary parts, such as this chain adjuster on either side of the swing arm, it is visible that a good design was not necessary to fully release this motorcycle. Things as simple as having threaded holes for your spools are also missing, making customers resort to rear stands that lift by the swing arm, or making them resort to aftermarket spools which go through the rear axle, making it only useful to clean and lube your chain as the wheel cannot be removed while these spools are present. The removal of the seat is also quite cumbersome compared to other motorcycles in this lineup. If your battery was ever to die, instead of popping the seat off in a couple of seconds, this motorcycle requires you to use tools which take much longer. The gas tank is not visible from the outside and is actually under quite a bit of plastic, which makes this bike look cheaper. But on the positive side, if these plastic panels were ever to get damaged, they would be much cheaper to replace than a full gas tank. With a slight raise in price, the Yamaha MT-09 offers a slightly more premium feel. The gas tank on this motorcycle is fully exposed and has a very unique angular shape to it, which sets it apart from other motorcycles. For the extra cost of this model, you as a buyer get threaded holes in the swing arm, which is a plus. The seat can be easily removed with a simple twist of the key, allowing you to access the battery, fuses, and other electronics within seconds. The main frame of this bike is not tubular and complements the overall modern design. With the Yamaha MT-10's MSRP being so much higher compared to previously mentioned motorcycles, you would expect the construction quality to be much higher than the cheaper alternatives. The gas tank is exposed only halfway, with the sides being covered with painted plastics. The gaps between the plastic and the gas tank are quite big, making it easy for dust to make its way through, which makes it more difficult to clean. The tail section of this bike has a very simple looking tail light and flimsy spoiler type of plastics, which can be easily broken off by the rider or a passenger who has no idea that they're there. Thankfully for this motorcycle, Yamaha did do a good job creating a visually pleasing windscreen. Meanwhile, the cheaper alternatives don't even get one. The power on the MT-07 kicks in at about 0 RPM, which makes it super fun in city use. If you were ever to put this bike onto gravel, you would be spinning out the rear wheel pretty much every time you would apply the throttle. However, the engine does significantly lag in the top end, which felt with anything above 120 km an hour. But this bike is not slow in any means, and with some effort you'll be able to get this thing above 200 km an hour. The MT-09 sits right in the middle when comparing these bikes. The power doesn't kick in right away like it does on the CP2 engine, so you do have to wait ever so slightly a little bit more, but it's not much. The acceleration that you acquire from this motorcycle is many levels above the MT-07 and is definitely exciting, especially on the back roads. But all good things must come to an end, and similarly like the MT-07, this bike does fall off at the top end, but not nearly as fast as this engine is quite bigger. The MT-10's power delivery is nothing similar to what we've mentioned. Unlike the MT-09 and the MT-07, the MT-10 has a lot of trouble producing low-end torque. This surprisingly makes this bike pretty difficult to launch quickly from a full stop, requiring the rider to slip the clutch for longer periods of time. Otherwise, it feels like this bike is going to stall if the RPMs are too low. As soon as you get over that initial stage and you get towards the end of the mid-range, this bike really starts to pull as hard as a freight train, pretty much all the way until the red line. this bike definitely has the most insane acceleration out of all the naked bikes that Yamaha offers, which makes it really exciting to ride. The power delivery is very unpredictable as well, which is not recommended for beginner riders, as it's really easy to flip over this motorcycle if you're giving it too much throttle. Now, if you guys ever had trouble mounting your action camera on the front of your helmet, check out Ridetech Moto. Ridetech Moto offers custom action camera mounts which go exactly in the center of your motorcycle helmet, which provides the cleanest and the most aerodynamic mounting solution for your action camera. With the expanding catalog of supported motorcycle helmets, it is very likely that Ridetech Moto has a perfect mount that will match your needs. Go to ridetechmoto.com for more details. When it comes to electronics, the Yamaha MT-07 seems to only have electronic fuel injection, and that's about it. This motorcycle doesn't offer any power modes, as the throttle cable is directly connected to the throttle bodies, limiting any possible lag that can come from an electronic throttle. This provides an instantaneous response from this bike's engine, which feels incredibly sharp. The Adventure Series bike Tenere 700 also features this engine, and I can imagine how well it feels on the dirt. In terms of visuals, the digital LCD display shows all the needed information such as multiple trips, gas gauge, gear indicator, outside temperature, and engine temperature. The digital LCD display is directly mounted to the handlebars, which makes the display not visible when the rider is looking straight onto the road. This creates a situation where the rider needs to move their whole head downwards to check their speed or the gear that they're in. In terms of handlebar controls, everything is very basic. The right side of the controls is very well designed and is easy to reach with your thumb. However, things start to get worse when you get to the left side of the handlebar controls. It is very much difficult to reach the horn button with your thumb, as it's placed really far away, which just creates a less pleasing user experience. The MT-09's electronic package is very similar to the MT-07, but with a few added features. Unlike the MT-07, the MT-09 features an electronic throttle which enables this motorcycle to include multiple power modes. In theory, this is especially useful as the rider can adjust the power mode to the style of riding that they do, but I found myself riding in A mode 100% of the time, regardless of my riding style or the weather condition I was in. However, the B mode does significantly slow down the throttle response of this motorcycle, which can be useful to less experienced motorcycle riders. The electronic throttle also enables this motorcycle to include traction control, which is a plus as it can stop the front wheel from coming up at higher accelerations or rapid movements of the throttle. The traction control is also very useful at making sure that your rear wheel stays in place on rather slippery surfaces. The digital display on this motorcycle is also very similar to the MT-07, but is quite a bit smaller and offers a different mounting position. The digital display is put farther away from the rider, which makes it easier to check vital information from your motorcycle. As per the information, the MT-09's display adds the traction control levels and power modes. The handlebar switches are exactly the same as the MT-07, with the exception of the blank switches being filled up by the extra features. The MT-10 doesn't borrow any of these features from the previously mentioned motorcycles and is quite unique when it comes to electronics. The MT-10 features an electronic steering damper, which is a feature I feel should have been added on the Yamaha MT-09. The damper stiffens up the steering depending on the speed, which makes this bike feel insanely stable at higher speeds. And it also works as an additional safety feature in case the front wheel lands not in line with the rear wheel. At this price range, the bike also features cruise control, which works amazingly well and is very useful for longer trips. In terms of the display, the mounting position is very well thought out, and the display is placed past the handlebars, which offers the best viewing position. The display itself is fairly large, which makes it really easy to see all the needed information. The handlebar controls are completely different, featuring really large buttons which can easily be pressed with motorcycle gloves. Everything is really easy to reach, whether that be using your turn signals or pressing the horn button. Everything on the display can be easily controlled with a trigger on the left hand side, which makes this bike safer to operate as you don't have to remove your hands from the handlebars as you're changing the information on the display. Now let's talk about one of the most important points when it comes to buying one of these naked motorcycles: and that being the sound. I have recorded exhaust sounds from each one of these motorcycles with the exact same settings on the audio recorder being placed in the exact same position right above the exhaust. As a note, each and every one of these bikes feature a full exhaust system, with the MT-07 having the Akrapovic carbon tip full system, the MT-09 having an M4 full system, and the MT-10 having stock headers, ice exhaust mid-pipe, and Yoshimura slip-on. Enjoy the comparison. Now, from what you've just heard, I'd like you to vote for which sound you like the most in the top right corner of the screen. Great. Now I can already feel all those dislikes coming in, but I just wanted to let you know my personal opinion, and your opinion may vary when it comes to the sound of these motorcycles. The MT-07 exhaust sound delivers something you would expect from a V-twin, being a 2-cylinder parallel engine, and it definitely adds presence as soon as it started. The bike revs up really quickly, raising the volume level within an instant, allowing the bike to make instantaneous brap sounds. As you go up in the rev range, the sound stays fairly the same, just becoming louder and having a slightly higher pitch. The way this bike produces power really made it fun riding it in the city, as it required very little power output to make a lot of noise. Now pair that with the short gearing this motorcycle offers and a quick shifter, and this bike sounds really cool on every upshift. The MT-09 has a very unique sound, and there are not a lot of motorcycles that produce it. The 847cc triple engine produces a much higher pitch tone, which is pretty rare within the motorcycle scene. As you get higher in the RPM range, the pitch gets significantly higher and definitely resembles something that would come out of a sport bike. The sound of the MT-09 definitely has a more sport sound compared to the MT-07. When it comes to the MT-10, it's almost like this bike has 3 sound profiles depending on where you are in the RPM range. Upon startup, this bike sounds very similar to what you would find in an old American V8 engine as it idles. When riding this bike at normal speeds, the bike sounds similar to an MT-07's CP2 engine, but still being slightly different. Now when you go full throttle on this bike, the engine makes an insanely cool high-pitched sound, which sounds insane in my personal opinion. Now in all honesty, every single one of these bikes have a very unique sound to them, and all of them sound really good, but my favorite sound is by far the MT-10. As soon as you get on the MT-07, you realize right away that this is the smallest bike in the lineup, being really skinny around the gas tank area and the seat being fairly low to the ground. As the engine size is quite small, having 2 cylinders at 689cc, the weight is quite low at 400 pounds wet. This makes this motorcycle be incredibly easy to flick from left to right, especially on small twisty roads. This is where this bike shines. However, trying to lean this bike into a sharp corner or being on top of a bumpy road surfaces, it is visible right away that the front suspension is not quite adequate for sport riding. I felt like this suspension was not 100% planted on the ground below the bike, as the front suspension was quite jumpy. The rear shock on the other hand didn't give me as much problems, but I am a lighter person coming in at 156 pounds, so your riding experience may vary. As the MT-09 utilizes 3 cylinders to make its power, it will be naturally quite a bit wider than a 2-cylinder motorcycle. This also adds a little bit more weight to the motorcycle, making the MT-09 come in at around 414 pounds. However, I did not feel the extra weight that the MT-09 brought with its extra power, and flicking this bike from left to right felt almost identical to me when comparing it to the MT-07. When taking this bike on twisty roads, the adjustable front forks are very much appreciated. I do feel like this was a needed upgrade from the non-adjustable forks on the MT-07. The front felt very stable under my weight, which gave me zero problems. However, unlike the MT-07, the rear shock felt especially very spongy in its stiffest setting, which worked well for in-town use and was fairly comfortable. For track use, however, or sport riding, I would highly suggest upgrading the rear shock on the MT-09, and when comparing this bike to the MT-07, I did feel like this motorcycle did a much better job in the handling department. The MT-10 is quite a bit heavier, coming in at 460 pounds wet. Now pair that with the highest sitting position and you can really feel this bike's weight at a standstill. On lower speeds, this bike is a little bit harder to flick from left to right as it requires more of the handlebar input. Now, as you get into higher speeds, it does get easier when it comes to turning this bike, and I honestly did not get a worse handling experience compared to the lighter motorcycles previously mentioned. Now, although it may be a little bit harder to turn this motorcycle, the stability and the confidence that you get from this bike is levels beyond other MT bikes. The MT-10 suspension is way stiffer than the MT-09's and is really unforgiving to all objects on top of the seat. This doesn't provide the best in-town use experience and is definitely more suited for track use or twisty roads. The front forks are fully adjustable, as well as the rear, which are perfect from a weight at 156 pounds. And I don't see the need of a suspension upgrade. The brakes on the MT-07 are not great, but at the same time they're also not bad. Using the MT-07's front brakes will be a big upgrade for anyone coming from a beginner 300cc class motorcycle. However, I did feel like there was an awfully large amount of dead space before beginning to feel any braking power. This makes the brakes feel less responsive than they really are. Anything after the dead zone, the brakes become to feel adequate and do provide an average amount of consistent power, which I had zero problems with. The rear brake, on the other hand, does feel like you're pushing on mashed potatoes with your foot 100% of the time, which I do not appreciate. And the rear brake does feel like you're either giving it 100% of braking power or 0% braking power and nothing in between. The brakes on the MT-09 are slightly different from the MT-07. When playing around with the front, I definitely felt like the brakes were much tighter than the MT-07. However, when trying to come to a complete stop, the fronts were not nearly as linear as I'd like them to be. This resulted in me applying an excessive amount of pressure on the front lever, even in regular front brake applications. The rear brake is also pretty bad, similar to the MT-07, but I still felt like it was a touch better. Now, going up to the MT-10, you would expect the brakes to be much better than the previous bikes mentioned, and they are, but it's not as big of an upgrade as I thought it would be. The front lever feel offers way less dead space compared to the MT-07, which is a big plus. Upon heavy braking, the brakes feel really linear and consistent, but it still requires a lot of the lever pull to make a complete stop from higher speeds. I would still take these brakes over the MT-09 and the MT-07 from factory, but I did hear that higher quality brake pads improve the braking performance tremendously, which I will hopefully test out in the future. As for the rear brake, the MT-10 does offer a much better feel. Before we get into the throttle response, I wanted to note that all three bikes were tuned to the aftermarket exhaust, and the fuel diesel cut was also disabled for the most smooth throttle response. The MT-07 throttle cable is directly connected to the throttle bodies, which provides the most instantaneous throttle response. Now pair that with an engine that has a lot of power down low and a very short first gear, the on-off throttle response is pretty bad. If you're in traffic, I will highly suggest just upshifting into second gear and just staying there, and if you're looking to be in first gear, I highly suggest slipping the clutch every time you go from off to on. With the MT-09, the second gear is really smooth, which gave me a good experience. Similarly to an MT-07, however, the on-off throttle in the first gear was also pretty bad, catching me off guard a couple of times when making a turn on low speed as the bike would violently jerk itself forward on slight acceleration. The MT-10's first gear is much smoother than the MT-07 and the MT-09, however that does come at a cost. Compared to other motorcycles, the MT-10 does take a bit more effort to get going from a full stop. The first couple of thousand of RPMs do require you to play around with the clutch lever to get a smoother start. However, anything above 25 kilometers an hour or so, the on-off throttle response is quite great and does not require you to play around with the clutch when being in congested traffic. In terms of the clutch pull itself, although the MT-10 does feature a slipper clutch, it is however still the heaviest pull out of all these bikes. The MT-09 also features a slipper clutch, and the clutch lever pull is really light, which can be easily squeezed with just one finger, which was a big plus. The MT-07 however does not have a slipper clutch, and the clutch pull is quite heavy, but not nearly as bad as the MT-10. Now, the way all of this works, if you have a more popular bike, most of the time the bike will have more aftermarket parts available. The MT-07 and the MT-09 are by far more popular bikes compared to the MT-10 due to the lower price of the bike themselves and the insurance, especially in Canada. So if you are looking to customize the crap out of your bike, it will be much easier to do so either on the MT-07 or the MT-09. Looks are always subjective and everyone's opinions are different. The MT-07 has a more traditional design that is similar to many other bikes from other manufacturers. What makes it traditional is the single headlight up front, which looks pretty basic, but however I do really like the tail section and the tail light for both the previous generation and the current generation of the MT-07. The MT-09 definitely looks a little bit more premium with an awesome angular design on the gas tank, the swooping swing arm, and the awesome looking frame. The headlight assembly is also very different from anything that I've seen, so that's a big plus. Overall, I think I prefer the looks of the MT-09 compared to the MT-07. In terms of the looks with the MT-10, it's definitely a couple levels above the MT-09 when it comes to uniqueness. First of all, there aren't nearly as many MT-10s out there on the street, which makes it more unique just right there. The bike is pretty big and looks like a really powerful bike, which it is. The headlight assembly has many angles, definitely looks not ordinary, which I really like. The overall looks are just super aggressive and is very different from all the other bikes around the world. However, the MT-10 does feel a little bit more plasticky compared to the MT-09, but with all its drawbacks, I think I still prefer the looks of the MT-10. If you're just starting out or looking for a second motorcycle and definitely want to go for a more powerful bike, I will definitely suggest going for the Yamaha MT-07. First of all, the insurance will be the cheapest for this motorcycle and it will have more than enough power for your everyday needs. The bike is more than powerful for in-town use, is more than fast for twisty roads, and is completely adequate for highway speeds. I've owned this bike for 2 years. I really enjoyed having a lot of options when it came to customizability. The low end torque was also really fun, and I don't have any regrets getting this machine as a second bike. I would definitely not suggest going for an MT-09 as your first bike, but it may be okay as a second bike. The motorcycle is really fast and it has insane amount of mid-range torque and is really easy to flip if you pin the throttle. This bike is however really smooth in second gear after getting it flashed, which equals in a nice smooth ride. The bike is more than capable for doing high freeway speeds. The in-town use is also really good, and this bike is amazing for twisty roads. I rode this bike for multiple weeks and I could really not tell that this bike was heavier compared to the MT-07. The front suspension does feel better on the MT-09 compared to the MT-07, and it's just as easy, if not easier, to flick this bike into a corner. If you're really looking for a fun motorcycle, you really don't need the Yamaha MT-10. I've owned this bike for about 6 months now, and I can safely say I only use about 50% of its power on the daily. By the time you rev out this bike on the street, you'll be going way past triple digits. The front wheel will be coming up in the first 3 gears, and it will be really easy to get arrested on this thing if you're not careful. However, just because I didn't need this bike didn't mean that I didn't want it, and I have no regrets in buying it. This bike feels insanely stable on the highway, way more stable than other MT bikes. The suspension on this is fairly premium and really feels awesome in twisty roads. I really love the feature of cruise control, and the steering stabilizer just makes me feel more safe. It's not the greatest for in-town use due to its having way less torque in the beginning, but it's doable. First gear is really smooth, and the quick shifter comes as stock on 2018 year models and up. The bike is really heavy, especially at a standstill, and I would not recommend this bike for a first time rider or a really short rider. This bike, however, I found is perfectly good upgrade from an MT-07, and I had no problems getting acquainted with this bike. So which bike should you buy? I'm not your mother. Do whatever you want.